Hey, Cypher here. Hello and welcome again to Assassin's Creed Chronicles China. This time I'm going to be continuing on with the story mission that I left off last time, but unlike last time, I'm going to record all of the history bits at a later time so that I'm not interrupting myself with gameplay. Because I really want to get to Edward Syed and his whole idea of Orientalism. Because this game has the potential of sinking into that particular trap. And I'll get into that during the game. So let's begin.
This was once a safe place for us assassins. Sangyong's tigers saw to the end of that. Their forces surprised and overwhelmed us, all but wiping out the Brotherhood. Gao Feng's death will send a message to the Templars. The assassins have returned.
Alright, so you remember last time we broke away from some prison where I had been captured by one of these tigers who were manipulating the government and are secretly part of the Templar Order. Well, this time we're going to continue that escape, I guess. Oh, you know what this is. Yeah, we're
Time
about
to
to
become
do
more
some
familiar with
eagle
my
jumping.
surroundings.
It looks like quite an abyss to jump off of. Well, let's do it anyways. Whee! And there goes the lower lumbar for the rest of the month.
什么都没有，你呢？没有，什么都没有发现。
Oh man, you remember the climbing mechanics on previous installments of these games? This is so much better. Okay, so let's talk about Edward Syed and how he affects the whole idea behind this game.
是啊，没什么动静。
Edward Syed was a historian who was particularly focused on Egypt. Not ancient Egypt, but colonial Egypt, sometimes called Mandate Egypt if you're talking about after World War I. But really, late 19th century, all the way until after World War II, when the British had pretty good control of that country. Yeah, the problem with stealth games is that you end up having to replay them a lot. But he came up with an idea that is often called Orientalism. Now, Orientalism is referring to the Orient not as some sort of racist term or anything, but the Orient as anything to the east of Europe. So the Orient includes places like Egypt and China and India and anywhere in the Middle East. Pretty much everything to the east of Europe. Interestingly enough, the word for Europe as in the West at that point was called the Occident, which are all derived etymologically from east to west. So Orient literally just means east. But Edward Syed was interested in studying the little people, the folks who had been not particularly well represented in history, especially in terms of Egypt at the imperial period during British rule. So he came up with a way of explaining how... Oh, it looks like I'm gonna drop a box on somebody. If I can get the aim correct. So, the essential idea is that people would do what he called essentializing other cultures. This essentializing was to make something anachronistic and unchanging. Basically, that idea that somehow there is no history of change in these places. That the samurai were exactly the same in 1100 AD as they were in 1877 and at the end of the Satsuma Rebellion. Completely different people, but oftentimes you'll see people are entrenched in the idea that these things are not changing and somehow are so traditional that they cannot be anything else. So you see it a lot with movies like The Last Samurai is actually a really good example of this, where they want to make the samurai into these kind of mythic figures that, first of all, never really existed, and that they were these mythic warriors. That I see people commenting on my channel sometimes where they'll on the episode that I did on The Last Samurai, where they actually are complaining that, oh, how could somebody with a cavalry saber go up against highly trained samurai? What are you talking about, highly trained samurai? This is a bunch of bureaucrats who just happen to wear swords. But that's the anachronistic view. They want to see the samurai as this unchanging mythic force. So with all of that, they tend to emphasize mysticism and tradition as standard things in the Orient. As though somehow the Chinese regime during this period of this game, which is the Ming China, is somehow exactly the same as the Qin dynasty in 300 BC. That is ridiculous, but you'll see it all the time, that somehow these places are supposed to be exactly the same, that the mandate of heaven was exactly that the mandate of heaven was exactly the same. I'm just going through and killing everybody here, aren't I? Well, the whole idea of the mandate of heaven is actually something that comes much later than the Qin dynasty. And things that are mainstays of our traditional view of China are things like, Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, as though these are traditions that were created, traditions or philosophies, that were somehow created and never really changed from their beginning, despite there being things like Neo-Confucianism, all kinds of different Buddhist sects and whatnot, let alone things like Chinese legalism, which is a philosophy that often was set up as contradicting Confucianism. But ultimately, the problem is people see these things as mystical and traditional and unchanging and ultimately anachronistic. These kinds of things can be really, really harmful to one's conception of history. Essentially, you see this... Haha. You see essentializing cultures as a form of backwardness, that it justifies some sort of... It justifies seeing your culture as particularly superior to another. Because while this is happening, the Age of Discovery is happening in Europe. The Reformation is starting.
大概是风太大了吧。
Just killed the heck out of that guy. But somehow we're supposed to think that Ming China wasn't going through the same kind of tumult. This is a really bad conception, because when you see a nation as backwards in its history, then you see it as being able to justify imperialism. That, as a famous children's book author put it, it's the white man's burden to come and fix that backwardness, to modernize those countries. I've talked about modernization theory on this channel before. And yeah, it's not right, to say the least. And thus far, I've noticed on this game, there's no guns, for instance.
This is where we used to keep the Assassin Scrolls. I should try to retrieve as many as I can while I have the chance.
Even though they had guns in China long before Europe, and, well, it's not like this is the 12th century or something. This is the 16th century. Europe was already starting to take over the New World. And yet, it feels as though this person could be placed in Han China during the 6th century AD, just as likely as it is in 1526, as it's supposed to actually be depicted. Now, I'm not saying that this game needs to be accurate in any way. It's a frickin' Assassin's Creed game. But when you're dealing with China, or in the next installment it is India, you have to be really careful not to essentialize other cultures. Not to turn them into these caricatures. Because that kind of ideology plays into imperialism. It justifies imperialism. And it's wrong. Not only morally or ethically, to be honest, I don't care that much about whether it's moral or ethical, but just the fact that it is not historical. It badly damages someone's understanding of history and therefore their understanding of the world. Ethics and morals follow that. So when we're playing games like this and are unaware of how much it essentializes Chinese culture, it's highly detrimental. And that's what Edward Said was getting at. He was framing it in the whole view of Egypt, that Egypt somehow was an unchanging place after the Turks took control, and even once the British came in, that somehow they were modernizing the place, when in reality the people that he was studying were actors in their own right. They had their own wishes that were not always traditional or mystical. They didn't have to rely on religion to justify what they did. They had their own motivations. This kind of looking at history to de-emphasize problems that colonialism had brought is a whole form of study called post-colonialism. And Edward Said is probably one of the earliest post-colonialists. Of course, this whole series is pretty riddled with Orientalism. Even though the assassins themselves are constantly changing and whatnot. Oh look, a dead body. Oh, we just found a dead body. Everybody look around and do something. I just hide in a corner. Amazing how easy that is. A lot of this game is just based on waiting around. But as I was saying, looking at this game, and it's the series that it's based around, the assassins might change, but the places in which these things happen, especially if it's not in Europe or America, then it is this caricature of the culture in which it resides. The first one with Altair is essentializing Muslim culture. And specifically, that point in time when the Islamic world was in a huge state of flux because of the Crusades. Which, mind you, had already been going on for a century or two by the time that that game began. So, I'm not too deep into this game yet, but this is a pitfall that the Assassin's Creed games have already fallen into, and I could easily see this one being bad as well. But of course, it doesn't get in the way of just a good stealth game, and oh man, I loved Mark of the Ninja, and this is turning out to be just as good. They keep on introducing new mechanics like this by showing you somebody getting killed right below you, and then you have to avoid getting killed in the same way. Oh, just as I figure out how stupid you can be around those things. Problem with stealth games is that when you trigger something like this, you end up having to wait, or you have to wait for guards to pass you, or anything along those lines. Then they go back to their normal pattern, and then you just wait until they get into a place that you can pass them. It's fun, but it can be tedious at times. You have to walk past these canaries, by the way.
我同意，我们不能让任何人通过。保持警戒，我们得保持戒备才行。我同意，我们不能让任何人通过。
So, while we're talking about post-colonialism and folks like Edward Syed, let's talk about subaltern studies. Now, the term subaltern originates with Antonio Gramsci. He was an Italian Marxist and theoretician, and he came up with this idea of cultural hegemony. Now, the idea of cultural hegemony, and you'll notice that a lot of these post-colonialists have very similar ideas, but are not exactly the same. And here I am getting in a fight. You don't have very much health in this game, so you have to be very careful with what you're doing. So I'm gonna go hide in a corner here, and eventually the alert will go away, and you can just go about your merry business. So back to Gramsci. Cultural hegemony is the idea that one culture is able to assert itself as superior or authoritative over others. Now, he was referring to one batch of Marxists talking to another batch of Marxists and saying that their ideas were wrong, and all the infighting that goes on with Marxism. But the idea of cultural hegemony has really stuck with academia. Because if you think about it in terms of colonialism, that one culture may assert itself over another, well, it's kind of obvious the applications there. But it's not just about, being able to, I don't know, kill people who disagree with you or whatever. It's also talking about being the authority on something, as in, well, I did an episode on it a while back on how the victors don't write the history, but this is more what people might be referring to when they say that victors write the history. It's that when you are the cultural authority on something, that you kind of have the ideology that is considered to be the correct one. You know, might makes right. And so those who are not represented by that ideology are depressed by the hegemony. They are what are controlled by cultural hegemony. And Gramsci had a word for this, specifically the people who are underrepresented by the hegemonic culture, and that is subaltern. So those who are depressed by the hegemony are the subaltern. Now, normally when you talk about subaltern studies, you're talking about, you know, race, class, and gender, anything that has been historically depressed and, I mean, not depressed, oppressed, and trying to give them a fair shake. But it actually means something deeper than that. You'll hear historians refer to the subaltern as in something that, you know, just isn't represented very well in history. You know, that women were in the subaltern prior to 1919, or something along those lines. But not really, they were still writing, they were still you know, they might have been oppressed, but the idea of the subaltern is greater than that. It's those who are... Oh, here we are, right at the end.
Is it done?
Gao Feng is dead, Sifu.
As is Ma Yongqing.
The butcher? Good. Our plan worked. Who's next?
Patience, sister. We must move carefully. Zhang Yong and his tigers control the Empire now.
He is down 2 tigers after tonight. Gao Feng did not have the box. I did not retrieve it in time.
Worry not, young one. We knew that was a risk. To allow yourself to be captured without the box would have meant certain death. We will get it back. Maybe the Templars will even lead us to the missing piece.
Perhaps. But now I'm afraid we have just given our enemies a dangerous weapon.
Take some rest, little sister. Together, we will free our land from the Templars and their pawns. Zhang Yong and his tigers. We will rebuild our brotherhood.
Well, I'm gonna have to call it quits on this. I'll talk about the deeper aspects of the subaltern and cultural hegemony in the next episode. So be sure to subscribe and check that out when it comes up. I'll talk to you next time.